Great. Thanks very much, Sally. Sorry, you're meant to have Hannah cheering this, but I've had to step in. So my name is Bruce. I'm head of policy at the Scottish Wildlife Trust, and we house the secretariat for the Scottish Forum on Natural Capital um, within our organisation. I'm just really pleased to see the Scottish Forum going strength to strength in supporting things like this discussion today. So I'm going to just try and put a little plea out there. If you're not on our base camps or involved through any of the different forum or the Scottish Forum already, please do get involved there. And I'll jump straight onto the agenda now after getting that little plug in. I think it was the 24-25 budget process and tax review that sort of committed to taking a closer look at carbon land tax, and the government asking the Land Commission to step in there. So we've got both technical expertise on the policy side in the shape of Katherine from the Land Commission, and we also have technical expertise in the shape of Mark and his team on the call today. So that's fantastic. The aim of this research is to inform the exploration of a potential carbon emissions tax in line with that budget and tax strategy I mentioned. But this research specifically focuses on feasibility of taxing emissions, and it does not address the principle of the detailed design. And I've been told that 3 times already. So if we can just try and keep out of the detail today, I think that would be greatly appreciated. I think first up, we're going to move into a short overview and introduction by Kathy from the Land Commission, and then we'll move into a little bit more of the detail from Mark. So I'll hand over to you now.
Great, thank you very much. I'm just getting my slides up. Yeah, it's really great to be able to speak to you today about this work. It's taken up a lot of my time over the last year. It's really fascinating, it's really complicated, and I've got the nice job of setting up a discussion and then handing over to Mark and the team to get into the technicalities of how this might work. So just by way of introduction, my name is Katherine Pollard. I'm the head of policy at the Scottish Land Commission. I have been working on tax for about 5 years now. So this is a slightly new angle to our work and builds on our previous advice. So the task, we were given the task of considering options for exploring options for considering how tax and regulatory changes could support land reform and reduce greenhouse emissions from land. And as part of this, there was a specific request to explore options for a carbon land tax. Now, the Scottish Government has done quite a lot to support and tackle climate change, and it's committed to looking at all of its available levers and tools in doing this, and this is why we're looking at tax. Early on in our stakeholder engagement, it became clear that in the land use and land use change in forestry context, peatland is a priority. So as a big source of emissions, but also as a huge potential carbon sink. So whilst other land uses are available, much of this work is focused on peatland, and this is where I will start. And this is essentially the basis for our work, and then this is where Mark and the team's work comes in as well. So whilst other land uses may be applicable, we are specifically looking at peatland. Of course, when we're looking at any specific land use, there are other unintended consequences and impacts on other land use objectives. So this is something that the Commission has experience in working on, looking at different impacts, particularly on communities and other local factors, which is why we are committed to working with government on exploring the sort of unintended consequences, the impacts, but also the opportunities linked to looking at tax in this context. So it's been very much a collaborative effort working with Scottish Government. And I thought I'd just quickly set out how the Commission works and why perhaps government is working with us on this. So the Scottish Land Commission is a non-departmental public body. We were set up in 2017 as a result of the 2016 Land Reform Act. And at the core of our work is this idea that ownership and the use of land should support thriving people and places. So it's very much about people influencing decisions about how land is used, about power, so ensuring that power and control on land is shared more widely through different ownership models and governance, but also importantly, prosperity, ensuring that the value and benefits of land are used fairly to create economic prosperity and well-being. So our advice to ministers in 2022 really builds on that and looks at how tax can play a role in supporting land reform activity. And in this work, it was quite clear that there isn't a very strong direct link between tax and land and all the opportunities that tax can bring. For example, creating revenue, also incentivizing certain types of behaviours. And this is where this work fits in. It's about the role of tax in incentivizing, for example, peatland restoration. So with this in mind, we took forward some work over the last year or so to look at the role of a carbon land tax in supporting climate change and reducing carbon emissions from land. So to do this, we held 2 round tables with a huge amount of different stakeholders with different experiences. And this is where peatland emerged as a priority to look at and sort of testing some of these ideas and assumptions. We've also undertaken research looking at the role of land valuation. So how do you even make decisions around what land is valued and worth, and therefore what's the role of tax? So that bit of work is on our website. We also looked at international evidence of fiscal levers to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So this is something that Scottish Government led on in 2024. And of course, this bit of work that Mark and the team will talk about, measuring carbon emissions from peatland, is also part of this wider package of evidence. There's also more work underway to look at landowners and looking at who's in scope for potential peat emissions. So this is work that's underway, and I'll talk about why that is important. And all of this will be packaged up in advice to ministers. So the Scottish Land Commission will be presenting its final advice in due course and presenting a route map, so really practical recommendations that Scottish Government could take forward if it wishes to do more in this area. But needless to say, it's really complicated. Not only is this a novel idea, but there's also lots of what I call sort of basic infrastructure, so the tax infrastructure that needs to be put in place in order for Scottish Government to be able to use tax in this context. And I'll just briefly run through a couple of emerging findings as to why I'm saying this. So first of all, it's for a carbon land tax in peatland, it's unclear what the impact on ownership and tenure might be. So there isn't just one type of landowner that has degraded peatland, but it's public, private, community owned. There are crofting and tenant farming implications, and all of this needs to be really carefully considered if we were to pursue a carbon land tax. We would also need to understand what the clear role for taxes in this context. So there are a lot of existing incentives and grants and payments, and also existing taxes that any potential carbon land tax would need to be aware of. So I guess there's a question here about what is the additional value of a tax in this context. We would also need to be really clear about what kind of peatland is in scope. There are different priorities and different definitions of degradation, so we need to be really clear about what we are actually trying to tackle and why. And then we would also need to understand the impact on the land market. There might be positive and negative impacts of a tax in this context. So all of those things need to be really clearly understood and thought through to provide ministers with a clear choice as to whether to pursue with this or not. There are also some other findings that I think are important for wider sort of land taxes, which is around capacity, methods and tools. So our work on international valuation approaches for tax have highlighted that there is a real need to invest in the kind of tax infrastructure we want to create for the future. So do we have the right data sets? Do we have the right methodology for valuing land in this context? And what tools are there to kind of assess tax on an ongoing basis and the impact of that tax? So these are all considerations for government. And then finally, we need to know exactly what land is in scope and have that mapped. Previously, we've recommended having a one-stop shop, a sort of cadastral mapping approach in order to give ministers the option for taxing land in different contexts. And we've recommended this previously, and we're doing more work on understanding what other countries are doing about mapping land and having all of that information in one place. So moving on, I would just say that we're at the stage where we're just consolidating our sort of findings and considering how a carbon land tax might work, but also looking at the role of tax in supporting land reform. And I think one thing I would just leave you with is that we would need to build pragmatic steps for the tax system. So all these nuts and bolts that open up these different options to ministers, they all need to be in place. And we can't look at a carbon land tax in isolation. So that's just briefly the wider policy context, where we are, where we're going next. So I'd watch this space for our final advice. And at this point, hopefully I've set the scene for Mark and his team. So I'll just hand over to you, Mark.
So can I just quickly jump in and say, just remember that I've put a little notice about the recording in the chat there, and please do remember the Q&A section. I'm sure there's a few Q&As built up after that from Katherine. So thanks very much. I'll pass over to Mark.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. So just looking at the Q&A, I can't see anything yet. And I'm hoping that the rest of my team, when things do come in, are also able to see them, because I'm hoping that multiple of us can help answer questions.
Keep a wee eye and make sure they're flagged in case anything pops up.
And yeah, so do ask away. So yeah, my name is Mark Reid. I'm a Professor of Rural Entrepreneurship and Director of the Natural Capital Challenge Centre at Scotland's Rural College. And I've got various policy and market roles, and have been leading a team of experts from across the natural and social sciences, from a range of institutions, many of whom are represented here to help engage in the discussion. And our goal was to have a look at the feasibility of such a tax technically. So there are many things that we can argue about in terms of whether it is right, how to make such a tax fair if we were to implement such a tax. But that's not our question. Our tax is, if you wanted theoretically to introduce a tax like this, then technically, how would you measure liabilities in a way that enables people to take management actions and then measure the effect that that has on their greenhouse gas emissions, and hence reduce their liabilities in a way which is sufficiently precise. Now, the context of this is, of course, that we've got this huge target that's just been increased with the new climate change plan. And the approach that we've taken to date has been dominated by incentives. But the question that many people are now beginning to ask is, do we need a stick to those carrots? And the idea of a land emissions carbon tax, similar ideas around integrating peatlands and woodlands into the UK emissions trading scheme, all effectively classify this as a pollution problem that needs to be sorted in some kind of regulatory way that forces people to do something. And of course, a tax has the potential to then bring in additional revenue that can go into further incentives. And so, yes, it needs to be fair, but ultimately, whether we can do something which is fair is going to hinge to a large degree on the technical credibility of the methods underpinning the measurement of liabilities, so that we're actually able to reflect real difference between land holdings that are degraded and emitting versus those that are not or have been fixed. And so we need methods that are transparent, that are auditable, so that people can complain, they can appeal, and we've got ways of testing whether or not this is actually right or not. And it needs to go beyond the highly accurate methods that we currently use in the greenhouse gas inventory and peatland code, that are accurate but lacking in the level of spatial and temporal precision or resolution that we need for a tax. And the issue with these methods is that they are categorical. So you move from one condition category to another. And that means that as a landowner, if you are classified in one category, you're going to have to do a whole load of things, and you will get no relief in your tax until eventually you flip into the next category. And so we're looking for something that can give us a more precise, continuous scale rather than a categorical scale, hence the need for this research. So one slide of key findings, and then I'll talk through the recommendations and the way in which we might be able to fill some of the evidence gaps and pilot some ideas. So first of all, as I said, the current methods are not sufficiently precise, is the word, not accurate, to be applied in the context of a tax. And it's worth bearing in mind that there would also be quite significant cost to this. So if you just think about the kind of field surveys that are done to support categorization in the peatland code and doing that at scale, that's a lot of cost. And of course, risk of disputes, especially around those category shift changes, which again just adds to complexity and cost. So the key constraints that we need to work with, first of all, are issues with our mapping. So knowing exactly where our deep peats lie, and the condition baselines. So even if we know where the peat is, do we know what condition it is in? And then we do have methods that meet all the criteria we're looking for in terms of precision, spatial and temporal resolution, but they are too expensive to use. Closed chambers, micrometeorological towers, wonderful if you're a researcher and you've got a big budget, but this is not fit for a tax. So what we've focused on is the idea of water table depth as a proxy, because water table depth is something that you can measure in a more cost-effective way than directly measuring the greenhouse gas emissions themselves. We know that there are robust relationships between both methane and carbon dioxide and water table depth, and that this responds to restoration. Let's have a think about this. And of course, where you instantly go is great. We could use remote sensing. And there are lots of companies out there who are trying to tell us that we can do this already. Whether this is using what's the word for it? Kind of multispectral type signals that will tell us about the greenness of the land, which is in turn a proxy for the water table, which in turn then is a proxy for the greenhouse gases, or radar methods that tell us how the bog is breathing, as people describe it, going up and down as the water table raises. The problem that we have, however, based on our evidence review, is that there is insufficient evidence actually linking these variables to greenhouse gas emissions. So we haven't actually done those direct measurements of greenhouse gases in the same places where we have that proxy data. And so we're still guessing too much. And we are not confident enough in the reliability of remotely sensed data on water table depth, which means that your only option then is to actually measure the water table depth. And so the idea here would be that you would have to install a dip well network. We're looking at the drained and modified, so degraded land, again, depending on what that mapping baseline tells us. And then we're getting some quite clear evidence of how that water table is going up and down, and what management interventions do to change that. But of course, that is costly and it's expensive. And so looking at what's out there, there are new water table depth sensors that are under development. We anticipate will be hitting the market soon. So is the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology that are developing these. And they can substantially increase capital costs without weakening precision. And so that makes this perhaps a little more palatable, but I'll have a look at the costs in a moment. And of course, you always have to weigh the costs and the benefits in terms of whether this is in fact proportionate. And so our proposed approach is to pilot and do research and build this evidence base as we go, whilst also building capacity for a system of this complexity, giving plenty of time for testing and refinement before anything were to be rolled out at a national scale. Hopefully with, as you can see from this slide at the bottom, with a reliable remotely sensed system. But we're not there yet. So I'll go through each of these in turn, and then have a little look at the costs, the next steps, and then move into questions. So the first thing that we're identifying is clearly we do not yet have enough robust evidence for cost-effective measurements, and so we need more evidence. So it would be good to see more of the direct measurements. So that's typically chambers, closed chambers that capture everything that comes in and out of a piece of peat, and then these towers, micrometeorological towers, that will tell what's going on over a larger area. And we need more of this data so that we can build these more evidential relationships between what we might be seeing from remote sensing and what is actually happening in terms of water table depth and hence greenhouse gas emissions. If we're going to pilot water table depth measurements, then we're going to have to look at what we can do to make this as cost effective as possible. So we've got methods based on some work that Jack Brennan has recently done that can significantly increase the efficiency with which we sample. So you have to have many less sample points than you might expect. But we need to really think that through and work out in the real world what the spacing would need to be, how frequently you'd need to be collecting that data, your quality assurance processes, etc. As I said, you need to get this relationship between your ground truthing data, the actual emissions, and the remote sensing data. And our proposal is actually to integrate multiple different remotely sensed signals to get as accurate and precise an idea of what's happening as possible. And of course, this critical issue of knowing exactly where our deep peats are and what condition they are in. We have to accept that this is never going to be perfect. And so our proposal is not to allow that to prevent us moving forward. Let's try and refine this, but as part of this, get a sense of where we have great level of certainty and where actually we're a bit uncertain. If we can have that pixel level uncertainty, then we can set some default liabilities based on where we think there are problems. We can start deploying our measurements then in a way which is proportionate, focusing in particular at the areas where we are less confident. That's the theory anyway. So there are two kinds of pilot that we thought could be possible. And so the first is working on bare and eroding peat. And this is just basically parking the water table depth idea for a bit, doing all of that research while we're piloting something a lot simpler that still starts to do what we want to do fiscally in terms of targeting the biggest pollution source. So by area, at least in terms of the tons of CO2 equivalents per hectare, this is our biggest problem. But also, handily, it's the easiest thing to be able to detect remotely, and therefore to be able to check. And so the idea is that we would start by taxing bare and eroding peats, and we verify that then with low-cost visual verification. So this is what our maps say are bare and eroding. Let's check some images. Great, they are. That's something that can be done quite quickly and easily. And if people say, yeah, but actually I own this and I know it's not, or at least not anymore, then that's the point at which you then move through to using the sources of evidence that we proposed on screen in that third box. To do this in a way which is fair and ultimately it's buying us time to do research at the same time as building capacity in terms of how you begin to actually get a system like this working, albeit on a very small pilot scale. The next step, though, is to move to this idea of a water table depth-based system. And this is ultimately where we want to be, in theory, with remote sensing. But the idea is that we have a pilot, and it could be that this is only ever at pilot scale until we have enough data to do this with remote sensing. But we use these national screening layers. Where is the peat? What condition is it in? We're deploying our sensors as efficiently as possible, as few as we can get away with. And now we've got that water table depth evidence coming in that gives us now evidence at that really precise parcel scale level over time of actually what's going on in terms of water table depth, and therefore the greenhouse gas emissions. Because we're using rolling averages, we can kind of account for things like drought years and things like that. More detail in the report. And we think that we can get the majority of this actually collected by landowners. Of course, there's a cost to that, that I would have thought would have to be factored in. That's not my job, but a question for policy colleagues if that seems like a problem. And ultimately, what we're doing is then trying to do this as far as possible, based just on all of that data that's being sent to us from those loggers in the field, only doing field visits where we've got really low confidence areas or where we've got challenges coming from landowners who are saying, no, there's problems, there's something going wrong here. And ultimately, this data then goes alongside that greenhouse gas data to help us build those much more robust relationships, which we can ultimately then use in a much more cost-effective, but hopefully by this point, much more reliable and precise remotely sensed option. And of course, things change. This is based on what we think now, based on existing technologies. And we've plucked that 250,000 hectares out of the air based on the peatland action target. It would be a policy decision as to how far a pilot might go. But to give you a sense of how expensive that might be, I've got some figures on screen there, brought down by those new sensors, but you still have your operating costs. And so they're fairly hefty when you bring in the model development costs, but we think that's an upfront cost, and it's then just being refined as we go with that data. But ultimately, we would not be triggering this actually being introduced as a system until we've got evidence that the modeled liabilities are accurate, they are contestable at the right scale, the right temporal resolution across different peat types and management states. And if we get there, yeah, your guess is as good as mine. But this is our proposal for a theory of change, effectively, in terms of how we might reach that place.
Great, thanks, Mark. Yes, that raises a lot of questions for me. I'm very conscious of my warning to not get into detail. I suppose there's lots of stuff around what the Scottish Government actually thinks it's incentivising by this tax. How do we marry it up with the different policy levers that we might incentivise on the other side as well? But yeah, those are all things sort of percolating in. So thanks for those very useful context setters. There's two questions. One is from me, but the first one from Emma, which I think is probably better. I'll just read out loud if that's okay. Understand this is a very early stage, but will you be considering landscape scale projects where peatland restoration is planned but in phases? If we can evidence that future restoration is planned, I hope these areas will not be subject to a future tax.
Yeah, so this is an example, Emma, of the kind of policy question that we get into if Scottish Government decides, yes, we think this is viable, we're going to introduce a tax. And I don't think that is the question on the table for Scottish Government at the moment. The question is the kind of pilot we are proposing something that is politically palatable, something that we would want to do. And so yeah, when it comes to the design of the tax, yes, this is exactly the kind of question that our policy colleagues have to ask. Our question is just simply that technically, could you do it? And the answer is effectively not yet, but here is how you would do it if you wanted to do this in an evidence-based way. So I'm sorry for sidestepping that. Policy colleagues, if you want to answer that question, you're very welcome, but I think nobody's done that thinking yet, because I don't think it's right to do the thinking until you know if there's something technically feasible. But I don't know,
Yeah.
policy colleagues, do you want to comment?
I'm happy to come in briefly if that's okay. Yeah, as you say, Emma, it's like very early stages. It's just testing the sort of principle of it. And I think, as you say, in the peatland context, we're aware that, you know, peatland doesn't just stay within one land holding and one boundary. So we would need to consider how you would approach incentives in a wider context as well. So these are definitely, you know, this sort of idea of regional landscape scale working is definitely part of our thinking at this stage. Like how would that play a role? I think it goes back to the point I made about understanding what the additionality is of a tax in this context and to what extent it would actually encourage the kind of behaviours you want to see. So yeah, that's all we can say at this stage, I'm afraid.
Bruce, in response to your question, if I may, Dan's written some very useful answers. Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, Andrew is also want to come in. Andrew, do you want to come in and address that first question first, then we can?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. It's Andy Turnbull here, Natura Investment Advisors. I guess this is a policy question, really, but it was, you know, have you considered, say, a positive taxation incentive similar to how forestry benefited from a surge of afforestation in the 80s and 90s by people and businesses being able to offset their tax liabilities? And that might, you know, so if you're thinking about taxing lots of different types of landowners in Scotland, similar to the IHT changes on forestry, a lot of these businesses or landholdings are cash poor, and there won't be money there to pay a tax, whether it's a community organisation or a large landowner. But if you can design a positive taxation system, which, yes, brings in less tax revenue and allows people to defer or offset their tax liability, then you could really stimulate a lot of delivery, I would imagine. And that can be through leases and partnerships with existing landowners, and sort of solves a private finance problem. And on the positive side, for the government fiscal point of view, you could perhaps not provide peatland action funding if you're offsetting your tax liability. Things like that, I think you could swap out quite easily. And of course, to Mark's point, you need to be able to track this properly. But I could see that as a really stimulating way to deliver those things. And yes, there's politics around that of wealthy individuals or businesses not paying tax, but at least they're not planting cypress spruce or lodgepole pine in the flow country, but they're actually restoring the peatlands this time in a lot of places. So that's just something to consider, or I just thought as we're listening. So that was my more like a point rather than a question.
Yeah, so can I hand to Scottish Government colleagues? Is this something you have thought of? We did think of something vaguely similar in relation to the ETS. I'll describe a bit more, but no, not for me at least, in our team, in our work, no. But Scottish Government, Rob, you were going to,
yeah. Yeah, hi. So I'm Rob Suter from the Tax Directorate in the Scottish Government. Sorry. And yeah, no, thanks. That's an interesting point. And we've been keen from the start that the kind of objective isn't to try and introduce a new tax. The objective is to try and incentivize peatland restoration. So we'd certainly be keen to consider if there's alternative approaches to kind of tax changes that are, you know, kind of positive. We'd be happy to consider them, with the obvious caveat that Scottish Government only has a kind of limited set of devolved powers. Inheritance tax, those kind of things, capital gains tax are all reserved to the UK government. That doesn't mean we couldn't lobby for, you know, particular changes, but certain things aren't within our kind of gift. But yeah, so kind of Mark and the team have really been tasked with the kind of considering how we might be able to make a tax work. But in the bigger picture, yes, I think we're happy to consider kind of any options really that would get us to the destination we want.
think, can I just come in on that as well?
Yeah.
One of our interim findings looks at the importance of understanding the relationship between all these different fiscal mechanisms, like, you know, what kind of grants and payments are available to incentivize that behavior, what's the role of tax. And I'm really struck by some of our findings in the international context, where countries like Denmark and the Netherlands, they have a lot more data available to influence policy decisions, to say, oh, this would work, or this is the potential impact, this is how much revenue it would raise, this is the behavior change. So I'm going to talk about data a lot, but actually data is such an important part of influencing different tax policies. And I think we need to sort of build that infrastructure to then help make decisions. That's not saying we can't do anything in the interim, but it's just, yeah, learning from international experience that they have that data in place to help understand what the impacts would be.
And I think part of our work as well is hoping to understand more about what that potential, what you call them, taxpayers, or who the people who have the land that needs restored, understanding more about who they are, what would influence them, what would actually kind of drive a behavior change. So I think there's still work to be done there as well on that bigger picture.
I think absolutely. I think what's really interesting about this as well is we've got the potential as well to we've discussed there incentivizing people to take up things like peatland action, but we've also got private sector potentially here. So we don't want to necessarily just be pushing towards government grants. There's other things available that this tax could help move people towards, and certainly money for biodiversity spend is really constrained at the moment. I'd rather be spending that biodiversity money on other things if we can use peatland code, for example, in this situation. You mentioned international there, and Mark, I know you were going to answer the question that I had, which is what's the closest thing that we've got worldwide here, and Daniel's put some useful comments in the comments section as well, but I'll let you jump in.
Yeah, brilliant. Will do. So I've just put in the chat with the spelling error. Oops, never mind. A report that we did for Scottish Government a couple of years back, looking at what are those kind of behavioural signals that people are looking at, what might influence whether people decide or not to decide to engage with restoration via markets in different scenarios. So more information on that there. The other thing that is worth considering would be similar to your idea, Andrew, is the idea of the emissions trading scheme. Effectively, what you do is you convert liabilities into an allowance. And in theory, if you were very generous and gave everyone 100% allowance, now for every unit of carbon that you take down, you can then sell that into the ETS at a significantly higher rate than you'd be able to do through voluntary markets. But of course, 100% allowance would be very generous and politically contested, no doubt. But it moves more in a similar direction. But I think you would need many of the things you would need for the tax system to make that work as well. Yeah, arguable. Potentially, we have the system already based on the peatland code. Dan can explain a bit more, if relevant, on the science that's going on, both science and policy-wise, though we do not see precedent for anything as rigorous as what we are proposing in Scotland. If I can speak to the policy side, Denmark have put aside a £5 billion fund to buy its lowland peats back and then sell them at a lower price to people who commit to restore and manage them sustainably. And they're saying that if you don't take that incentive and sell the land, you can keep it, but you'll get taxed. But their tax is based on emissions factors. So not based on the kind of work that we've done. That's quite kind of broad brush, waving your hands in the air kind of stuff. But what's interesting is that tax signal is already persuading people to, it's a good idea to just sell, because it's not just an incentive now to sell my land at market rate. I'm also escaping a tax. So I think that's probably the only thing we can learn is that behavioural signal from the Danish work. Dan, do you want to say anything more about the relevance of the German and Dutch work?
Yeah, I'll just say quickly that it's, I guess, moving in the right direction in that it's kind of the emissions from the inventory are tied to something that's changeable and the land managers can influence. However, their measurement just now seems to be just based on like really long-term averages. So they'll get a map basically of the long-term average water table depth and then say the emissions from this area is this. But it doesn't seem to be responsive just yet. They don't have like the kind of time resolution to pick up these management changes.
Yeah.
Bruce, can I just come in while we're on the international stuff? I think it's also worth bearing in mind that the countries we looked at for looking at how you even value land for tax purposes, they're all grappling with this. So whilst Denmark is, known for having made the first step in some ways, there are a lot of other countries that are exploring this. So Scotland's not unique in looking at how this might work. And I would just say that in Wales, for example, they've just announced that they're going to consult on a vacant land tax. So, there is some movement in the land-based tax space. So it is quite an interesting time to be looking at, well, what infrastructure do we have in place? What data do we have? Like, what are the potential impacts of this? And I'll put in a couple of links as well if you're interested in that side of things.
Thanks, Kathy. Yeah, they're in the chat section if anyone's looking for them. I've just stuck a question in the sidebar there. Just you can sort of upvote that or downvote that if you want to. But if you are representing a large landowner, does this concern you? My organisation, Scottish Wildlife Trust, is a large landowner. We have just bought a particularly large estate with an awful lot of unrestored peatland on it. So, should we be more concerned about this? Because, huge credit to John Muir Trust, by the way, who sort of kickstarted this off. I think it's a very good conversation to be having around how we can be using fiscal levers to try and move things forward. I'll be honest, the 2030 target the Scottish Government has set itself of reversing declines in biodiversity by 2030 is not looking good at the moment. So we do need to try and push things forward a bit. But yeah, does this concern you if you are a large landowner? Feel free to.
Can I say we did ask this question of large landowners in the work that I gave you the link to, and people were very concerned. A lot of estates saying, look, we're struggling to make this whole thing work already, and having a tax like this could push us to breaking point. Questions around who would be exempt and why, and issues around fairness, equity. But yeah, all of these come to the design phase, and the question, I guess, then is what are everyone's objections? And then I think the job of a tax team is to ask, are these game stoppers, or actually are there ways in which you can design a tax to make it fair, despite all of these different issues? I guess that would be the next phase of work.
Yeah, absolutely. Anecdotally, that's exactly what. Sorry, Catherine.
And the other thing, just to add, is that a lot of degraded peatland isn't just within large land holdings; it's also smaller sites. So, what's the role of slightly smaller land holdings, different tenures? Again, going back to some of our interim findings, I know others on the call are kind of working on this. So, it'd be quite interesting to get some reflections on what does it mean for small scale as well.
An excellent point. Just while we mull that one over, Charles, you've got your hand up.
Thank you. Yes, I was picking up the question about large estates and paying taxes and so on. One factor in tax design around land and property like that is the large value of those estates means that the return on the capital invested in them in terms of revenue and net profit is very, very low. And that is always going to be a factor in imposing any other cost on a rural estate owner, whether a wealthy private individual or another type of owner altogether. The complications around ownership isn't necessarily occupation and control have been rehearsed in the introductions, so I won't revisit those, but they just add to that complexity. I think there's also something which needs to be revisited around taxation. Traditionally and historically, if you look at various principles underlying the tax system, it has always been deemed desirable to tax land because you can identify it, you can't export it. It symbolises or represents wealth in some ways, and those arguments probably still have considerable validity. But there were also arguments that were developed at a time when it was much harder to measure and identify cash. That's become a lot easier since then. And when it comes to paying a tax, it's cash that you pay it from. So taxes which fall on available cash, so tax on profits, a tax on a capital gain, fall at the time when you have cash in hand to pay it. That's an underexplored area, in my opinion, as far as the palatability, political and social acceptability of taxes is concerned. Many people, including the elderly, for example, can be incredibly wealthy, but don't actually have the means to pay over the cash that is required of a tax. That would be my comment on the question about estate returns, finances, and the ability to pay taxes. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Charles. I'm just copying over a question that went in the chat, but I think was for the Q&A, Lindsay. Correct me if wrong, but landowner question: if it pushes owners towards peatland restoration and the creation of carbon credits, then no bad thing, but must make sure any tax is balanced by a fund big enough to cope with a large flurry of peatland restoration applications as date for tax approaches. Yes, and I'll just reiterate as well, I really would love it if this can help drive movement towards peatland code. So because the Scottish Government have committed to private sector to supporting private sector funding. I see this as a sort of a first step on that journey, really, and something that in my head is relatively achievable compared to some other areas. So yeah, any of the experts on the call want to jump in on that question?
It sounds fair. It's not really a technical question for us as a team, but if the policy colleagues want to say something.
Yeah, I mean, I can maybe jump in there. I think that's a kind of good question, and one that came out during a lot of the stakeholder engagement. There was about kind of, so there's the practical side of can you do this, but also then if you do incentivize people to restore their peatland, is there enough capacity in the system there to actually carry out that restoration? Is there kind of, if you do drive people towards this, they have to be able to change their behavior and adapt in the way that you're trying to push them towards. Otherwise, it's kind of unfair. And I think those are kind of big issues that still need more. We still need to explore more as well.
Yeah, definitely. And the other big issue that comes out for me from this is the sort of balancing with other environmental priorities at the same time. So deer management has a huge amount to play in this space. To my mind, there's not a lot of point on pushing hard on this if we also don't bring the rest of the sort of enabling framework, if you like, of other things along with it.
Yeah, it definitely needs a strategic sort of purpose. Like what are we using tax for and why, and what kind of, it's a very blunt instrument, like what kind of land use objectives are we delivering with that? What's the role of biodiversity, other local, community impacts? So these are all things that would need to be considered in more detail. But yeah, our interim findings highlight the kind of unintended consequences on other land uses. So yeah, it's something we need to think about in more detail.
Absolutely. Any more, or will I say that annoying thing of giving you 5 minutes of your life back?
I don't know if there's anything anyone else from our authorship team wants to add. Any comments? Klaus, Simon, Jack, yeah.
Just really one comment I was going to add, given the that previous discussion. I think it's important to recognise that a lot of the restoration work that's taken place historically has gone for sites which aren't actually that badly degraded, and perhaps one of the levers that this provides is actually that focus towards the really badly degraded sites which are disproportionately contributing to the carbon in the first place. So I think that's something that can build into that comment that Lindsay sort of put into the chat, because it's about focusing that funding, that very precious funding, whether it's from taxation or from grants, into the right places where it's going to make a difference.
Really nice point.
That was a great point to finish on, I think. Yeah, well, thank you very much. Quick question for Sally, really. What's the best way to get in touch if anyone has any points they want to make around this topic or anything? Is it just through the Basecamp site itself?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Bruce. And thank you everybody for attending and your questions and both presentations. Directly after this, what I'll do is I'll upload the recording. I'll create the questions bank. I'll forward it on to Mark and colleagues and Katherine and colleagues. And then we can circulate it to the registration list with everybody's emails if they want to get in contact, but also uploading onto the Basecamp as well.
Right. I'll put a link to the slides in the chat as well if you want to download my slides.
Thanks very much, everyone. Let's see the appetite for this in the next Parliament as well. That will always be an interesting side angle on everything as well. I don't know if you heard the Kemi Badenoch's speech from the Conservative Scottish Conservative Conference a few days ago, but interventions weren't the flavour of the month in that speech. So just like interesting political context on top of all this as well. Okay.
Bruce, I might just jump in with one final question just from Miranda here. Just can something more be said about next steps and timeframes for this piece of work? I don't know, Kathy, if you've got anything solid in the diary.
Yeah, from our point of view, we're shortly to advise ministers on next steps for this and sort of the conclusion of our exploratory phase. And then in regards to kind of wider work, I guess it's over to Rob. I don't know, Rob, if you're able to add anything.
Yeah, sure. So as Bruce said, we've got an election coming up shortly. So we're expecting to kind of conclude this phase of work with the recommendations from the Scottish Land Commission as to kind of what next steps might look like. But it would be for the kind of new incoming ministers of whatever new government we have to set out what they want to do kind of next on carbon land tax. So I'm afraid that's not a particularly helpful answer, but hopefully with a new parliament, a new government coming in, they can set out a kind of vision for the next parliament.
Yep, I think that will be the answer to any policy question for the next good few months at least. Sorry, Alex, do you want to say something quickly before we break?
I'll just allow their mic. There you go, Alex.
Oh, sorry. I think you might still be muted, Alex.
No, I think you should be good to unmute if you've got a question. Oh, their hand's gone down though.
It's gone.
Oh, accidental.
Oh, sorry. Okay, thanks, Alex. Great. Okay, well, that was really interesting. Thank you very much. And yeah, we can all reconnect to anything else on the Basecamp as well. Great. Thanks
Thanks very
all.
much.
Bye.
Bye.
Cheers.
Hey, Dan.
Cheers.